the Triathlon Show 337. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I am flying solo. I generally really like doing interviews because then I get the personal benefit of chatting with some really smart people that I would like to chat to anyway, even without the podcast. But I know from surveys I've done in the past that these solo episodes are also appreciated, so hopefully you will enjoy this one. I'll talk about some specific and actionable tips for each of the three disciplines, for swimming, biking, and running, from a triathlon context. So how can you improve your triathlon, swim, bike, and run? And I think that a lot of listeners will benefit from these tips to improve your performance. But before we get into that, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. Today, I want to talk about Roka's wetsuits and why they are so great. First, they have a wide range of wetsuits from the entry-level Maverick that is still extremely high quality. And I have tried the Maverick recently, and I was very pleased with how good it really was for an entry-level wetsuit. And then, of course, they have levels all the way up to the flagship model, which is the Maverick X2. All of Roka's wetsuits come with the patented arms-up technology, which maximizes shoulder mobility, which can otherwise be quite restricted and result in less efficient and slower swimming. And there are tons of fantastic features that you can read more about on roka.com. You can also get 20% off your Roka order by visiting roka.com/TTS. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer is a swim training tool that you can use at home that allows you to improve your technique, work on power and stamina, and save time and stay consistent. For a lot of age group triathletes, the swim is the discipline that is the most difficult to fit in, which we'll actually talk a little bit about later in this episode. But that means that it's also the one that kind of falls away the most easily. And when that happens, if you have an option to at least do something to work on your swimming at home, and that takes less time than going to the pool, getting changed, getting in the pool, and so on, doing it all in reverse, then that's an incredibly valuable thing. And with the Zen8 indoor swim trainer, you will have just that. Because when you might run short of time, so you can't get to the pool, you can still do at least a 20-minute indoor workout at home. And the Zen8 indoor swim trainer will really help you work on some specific skills that you might not even be aware of that you're lacking, like, for example, core activation, which it will really help you work on due to the built-in instability element of the swim bench. You can get 20% off from the Zen8 swim trainer by using the discount code that you can get on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. And it is a risk-free investment. If you don't love it after 2 weeks of using it, you can send it back and get a full refund. All right, so let's get on to the main topic of today. I will give some specific tips for swimming, biking, and running respectively, but all from a triathlon context, of course, and triathlon perspective. As you are probably aware, this is a question that I like to ask my guests as well. I tend to phrase it as, can you give 1 to 2 tips for the swim and for the bike and for the run for listeners to improve their performance? And I'll give it a go myself and give 2 tips for each disciplines. I'm not saying that these tips are necessarily based on the absolute number one ranked thing you should do within each discipline. I try to think about these tips as things that are really important, but maybe also to some extent are underappreciated or undervalued in the triathlon community, at least from where I see it and from my perspective. So just to give you a little bit of background information and context for how I was thinking about what I was thinking about when I was when I was thinking about these tips and planning the episode. So here we go. Let's start with the swim. And tip number 1 with the swim is to swim more. This is obviously very simple advice to give, and it can sound a bit like a cop-out from figuring out something more intricate, giving you a secret sauce or something. But I will say that I'm only giving this advice for the swim, not for the bike or for the run, because I think the swim specifically is where a lot of age group triathletes just do not realize how little they actually swim. For example, it's not uncommon that we get coaching inquiries to Scientific Triathlon from athletes with ambitions to qualify for Ironman World Championships or the 703 World Championships. And they are good athletes. They're training a lot. It varies, but let's pick a number. Let's say they're training 13 to 15 hours per week. But of those 13 to 15 hours, then less than 2 hours or 2 hours at most are spent swimming quite often. So, and this is a specific example, but I think that this is a pattern that I see in that athletes might have a decent understanding of what it takes to improve their bike and run in terms of the training volume they need to be training at based on their athletic history, how many years they've been in the sport, what it will take for them to improve. Because obviously the fitter you get, the more it will take to some extent. But this understanding of what it takes seems quite often to be lacking with swimming. And quite often people start thinking that they're not improving in swimming because there is some piece of specific technical ability that they're missing, or a key ingredient in terms of technique, or that they just don't have the talent, quote unquote, to swim faster than they are. But more often than not, I think that they just need to swim more. Obviously not mindlessly and not just swimming laps at the same speed up and down. That's not what I'm saying. It needs to be with focus and with quality. And then fitness and technique will improve, because swimming is a skill and it takes a lot of repetitions to make a skill really ingrained. It's like learning an instrument in many ways. And when learning an instrument, you would play every single day. That any musicians out there would obviously appreciate. So swimming, when we're trying to improve, even with 3 or 4 times a week, that's very minimal really in comparison, considering how difficult it is skill-wise. And another way to put things in perspective is that most professional triathletes would be swimming somewhere between around 18 to 25 kilometers per week. There are exceptions, but I think that is the norm. And they might be biking 10 to 15 hours per week. Again, there are definitely exceptions to that, but I would say that that is the norm. And with those numbers, what that means, if you put an age group, triathletes' numbers in perspective, a lot of very ambitious age groupers might do 70 or 80% of the bike volume that the pros do. But at the same time, they're only doing 25 to 35% of the swim volume. And I'm not saying that these percentages need to be equal, but I think that this discrepancy is too big, and that's something that can be improved. So when I say swim more, how much more is more? Well, that is impossible to say, because it depends on where you are in your triathlon journey and how much your overall time budget is, among other factors. And on that note, I 100% recognize that for some time-crunched athletes, you may just have to accept that you don't have enough time available to improve your swim without sacrificing too much from cycling and running. And in that case, it makes sense to just do an absolute minimal amount of swimming to just maintain your current level and focus on improving your bike and run. But if that is the case, then as an athlete, you need to be realistic and honest with yourself and realize that you can't expect to improve your swim. Or as a coach, you need to make it clear to your athlete that that's what they can expect, and explain the reasons for prioritizing the bike and run. As long as it's an informed decision that you agree upon, so that the athlete doesn't get frustrated with the lack of swimming progress, when the reality is that there's no way that they could be making swim progress given the limited amount that you're actually swimming, then it's okay. But it needs to be that informed decision, and you need to have an awareness of reality and what is realistic to achieve with the swim volume that you're doing. Now, if you do have as a goal to swim better, but you feel stagnant, then I would say that for a lot of listeners, not everybody, but for a lot of them, the solution is simply to swim more. One more thing on this note, frequency of swimming, in my opinion, trumps long workouts. And the slower the swimmer you are, the more this applies. So especially for more beginner or even intermediate swimmers, doing 4 30-minute swims per week would definitely be better than doing 2 1-hour swims per week, even though the total volume would be the same. So keep that in mind as well, that the frequency is really important and a variable that you need to consider, also separate from just the total volume. All right, so that was tip number 1 for swimming. And tip number 2 is to do a video analysis. And this is something I mentioned many times before, both in Q&A episodes, in TTS Thursday episodes, and in interviews that we've done and so on. But we can't perceive how we're actually swimming, what we look like in the water until we see ourselves on film. I filmed some really good swimmers, and even they always find something that really surprises them about their form in the water and their technique. So if you want to know what you're doing, then you have to see yourself on film. There's no getting around that. Even having somebody describe it to you, it just doesn't have the same impact and give you the same clarity as actually seeing it yourself. So doing a video analysis, ideally with somebody who is very knowledgeable in triathlon swimming, will allow you to find the 1 to 2 most important things to work on for now. And that is important, to not pick too many things, but to pick 1 or 2 things to focus on. And that will help you get so much more out of every workout you do, because you should be continuously focusing on these 1 to 2 key aspects in all of your swims. And then film again later to check how you're progressing and whether you should choose some new things to focus on, or whether you still need to keep working on the things that you're working on. There are some fantastic options for people that provide swim video analysis as a service, and I'm happy to give referrals if you live in the UK or Finland or Australia. I have contacts that I trust in these countries for swim video analysis, so happy to hook you up if you email me. Another great option is to get together with a friend and buy a GoPro and a monopole, and then you can film each other, and you can do that repeatedly whenever you want. So that is a fantastic option that I would highly recommend if you have that option. When you're actually doing the filming, if you do it yourself, then you should always get 3 different angles. You need the side view, and for this I recommend getting both above and underneath the water. And you need the frontal view from underneath the water, and you need the bird's eye view, so filming from directly above the swimmer or above yourself. So those are the 3 angles you want, and you can do even just 25 meters of each angle is enough. 50 meters is great. So actually a filming session, once you know how to film, it just takes a few minutes to get all of those angles. And that's enough to really make some really clear conclusions normally, in my opinion. You should be warmed up, having done a few hundred meters of easy swimming before you actually do the filming. But other than that, this can be done really, really quickly. A word of warning when it comes to doing the actual analysis: it is becoming knowledgeable enough to assess your technique yourself is difficult. So if you don't have a good amount of experience analyzing swim videos, I do strongly recommend getting feedback on the video from an objective expert on the topic. Otherwise, there is a risk that you choose something to work on that is not actually a major limiter in your swimming and end up being a bit of a waste of time, or at least not optimal use of time. So it's worth the investment to get professional feedback at least the first few times that you do this analysis. And then from there on, you will learn to recognize, okay, what are the main issues that go wrong? And you can use the previous feedback to see, have I managed to improve those things? And then move down the list, so to say, in the prioritization order. I did an episode back in TTS Thursday number 10 called How to Do Your Own Swim Video Analysis. So you can check that out if you want more information on a DIY swim video analysis. And I'll link to that in the show notes as well. But that's it for tip number 2 for swimming: to do a swim video analysis, and not just do it once, but do it repeatedly. Now let's move on to the bike. And tip number 1 for improving your bike is to go easier on your easy days. Something I've noticed, in particular with men, for some strange reason, is that it doesn't matter whether your threshold is 380 watts or 240 watts. Everybody wants to ride their quote-unquote easy rides at 200 watts, which is a funny pattern, actually, when you think about it. When your threshold is 380, then of course that's absolutely fine. But if it's 240 or 280, then that's probably pushing too hard on your easy days. And I think the reason that this is a problem that is so common, of pushing too hard on easy days, and the reason that it's so common in cycling in particular, even compared to swimming and running, is there are several reasons. The first one is that with a power meter, cycling is extremely quantifiable. So, for example, let's compare an easy ride with a power meter compared to going out and doing a long endurance run on trails. Everybody knows that pace doesn't matter when you're running on trails, so it's very easy and evident to not get sucked into caring about what your pace is when you run on trails. For example, it might be a bit different if you're running on flat roads, but even on hilly roads, but definitely it's not the same as with cycling, where every single ride you have that power meter to show you how hard you're going right in front of your nose. It's just so easily happened that you want to push it a bit higher than it should be. Maybe because that's what your mates are doing. They're riding at 200 watts and you want to do it yourself too, even if they might be fitter than you are. The second reason that we tend to push our power too hard on easy days is that when we're riding in a group or even with just one friend, it's not so much that we want to show off, although there is a bit of that as well, but we just forget what the objective of the day is, because it's fun to be out riding with your mates, and you can get sucked into that comfortable but slightly too hard intensity because it's feeling so much easier than it does when you're out on your own, even though physiologically you're still pushing a bit harder than you should be doing, simply, even if it's just from the perspective of you won't be able to go quite as hard the next day when you might have a hard workout planned. And the third reason is that cycling in particular suffers from this issue of going too hard on easy days, is that with hills, winds, and so on, staying in control of power means we have to go a lot slower than feels natural when the road starts to tilt upwards or we turn into a headwind. The tendency would be to push up that grade or push into that wind, and when we're riding with friends or in a group, then that is reinforced even further because they will do the exact same thing. So I'm definitely not saying that you should ride indoors or only on flat roads outdoors, or that you only need to ride on your own and that you need to be a slave to keeping your power number below a certain value, and anytime you go above that, you're kind of ruining your workout. That's definitely not the case. And I'm also not saying that there is even such a magical number below which it's rainbows and roses and above which you start to blow up your mitochondria or something like that. What I'm saying is simply that on average, many triathletes, especially male triathletes, could go easier on easy days and would benefit greatly from doing it, because they would get the same training effect from that day, but would be so much fresher, especially in the long run, for their harder days, and be able to push 1 or 2% harder every time they have a hard day and adapt better to that, recover quicker from those easy days, and be ready to perform when they really want to perform on those harder days. And it doesn't have to be, I'm not saying that this is for your 2 or 3 minute lung busting intervals. This is irrespective of whether your hard days are short and intense intervals or long extended tempo rides or tempo intervals or anything, things like that. But when you have any kind of harder intensity or higher quality or specificity, whatever you want to call it, then that's when you really want to perform. And those endurance rides should be the majority of your training, but they should not detract from those harder days. So that's the main takeaway from this tip. You can definitely apply this tip in swimming and running as well, but I'm using it here as my first bike tip, because I think the problem is the biggest in cycling. And tip number 2 for cycling is to train specifically for your goal race course. This is actually something I think often gets overlooked because I think that to prepare for your bike performance in, let's say, Ironman Cozumel, that will look quite different than preparing for your bike performance in Ironman Lanzarote. And of course, there are different examples that you could use than just those 2 races, but they came to mind. For Cozumel, which is a very flat course, you need to practice staying in the time trial position with absolutely no let up in position and no let up in pedaling for hours on end, for 180 kilometers to be exact, because it's such a flat course where that's exactly what you will be doing on race day. Of course, ideally, you would have a pretty flat road outdoors where you can simulate that kind of training. But if that's not the case, if all the terrain you have around you is hilly, so you'll have constant breaks from pedaling when going downhill, or you will have constant breaks from the TT position when going up some steep, short uphills or long uphills, then you might have to suck it up and do some long rides indoors on the trainer if training for Cozumel to get that specific training. For Lanzarote, on the other hand, to use that example, you will have long, steady climbs and long, non-technical descents. Your power during the race will not be constant, but you will have a fair bit higher power than your average power when going uphill. And then on the descents, it will depend on the grade and the speed, whether you're still pushing a bit of power or if you just recover. Cadence will also likely be variable, especially on courses where the grade of the climbs varies a fair bit. Depending on the grade of the climb and how strong you are, you might or might not be climbing in the TT position. So this is something you should research weeks or even months in advance of your race so that you can train accordingly. If the climbs are gentle and you're going at a speed of around, as a rule of thumb, let's say 25 kilometers an hour, then you will definitely be in your TT bars, or you should definitely be in your TT bars around that speed and higher. But if the speed is a fair bit lower, then it might be a wash or close to a wash, and the aero gains that you might have could be outweighed by higher and easier power production when sitting up. So knowing the speed that you will be going up the climbs is also important for knowing how to train. Should you actually be doing some climbing training sitting up, or should you be doing it in the TT position? Also, if your goal race has a lot of descending, then practicing descending skills should of course be part of your training and will be important for your race performance. If you're doing a race that is likely to have strong winds, then it's also worth it to try to get out on the bike on days when there are strong winds where you live to get more used to that. So in summary, I guess I just want to emphasize that a lot of times a disappointing bike performance in a race might not be because you didn't have the fitness or the power, but because you were not adequately prepared to apply that fitness and that power to the specifics of the course. Maybe you were not used to the variation in power on a very stochastic course with a lot of short, steep climbs, or maybe you couldn't stay aero for the duration of a completely flat course with no let up, or maybe you pushed really well up all the climbs and gained lots of time, but then your descending skills let you down and so you lose time going downhill. So prepare for the specifics of your goal race course to get the most out of yourself when it matters on race day on the bike. And now moving on to the bike, tip number 1 is to stay injury free to be able to be consistent. The large majority of triathlon injuries are running injuries. And that is the main reason why athletes at a certain point stop progressing on the run, because they just can't stay injury-free and keep up that consistency. It's very easy to say stay injury-free, but it's harder to do in practice because it's psychologically, I think most of us think that we're doing a good job of staying injury-free every time that we're not injured. And we keep thinking that right until the moment that we get injured. That's a bit of a funny paradox almost. But the reality is that almost all running injuries are developed over some time, not in one moment. They are overuse injuries. So there are a few key things to do when it comes to staying injury-free. And these are the process goals that you should have to be able to run consistently and have no injuries. The number 1 thing is to avoid big ups and downs in your running load. On the bike and the swim, you can get away with some bigger variations, but on the run, it's quite risky. So you want to try to do a similar amount of volume each week, or when you're progressing very slowly. We'll get to that. You want to have a similar frequency of running each week and a similar frequency and amount of fast running. So avoid any sudden changes in those variables. Progress things really slowly, especially the overall volume and the volume of fast running. I think especially the overall running volume is a variable that the 10% rule, I think, is just garbage. It leads to a lot of injuries because it's actually, first of all, 10% of an increase is very different if you're starting out, you're running 10 kilometers a week versus if you're running 100 kilometers a week. So it shouldn't be about a percentage. I think it maybe should be about a number of minutes. Let's say you're running 3 times a week. Maybe every 3 weeks you can increase by 5 minutes per run that you're doing, or every 2 weeks by 5 minutes per run. So if you're a beginner starting out, you're doing 3 runs of 20 minutes each per week. Then after 2 weeks, you can go to 3 runs of 25 minutes. And then another 2 weeks, go to 30 minutes, but then take a down week as well at some point where you go back to 3 times 20 minutes. So that's the rule that I would follow rather than the 10% rule, because that can get you into trouble, especially when you do it week upon week. If you're already running 50 kilometers and you go to 55 and then you go to 61 and then you go to 67, that's a progression that you don't want to do that's just very risky. Now, the second thing in terms of avoiding big ups and downs is to nip things in the bud. And with running in particular, it's always better to be safe than sorry. If you start to feel a little bit of a niggle, then take a few days off running, maybe do some extra cycling instead, or I would actually definitely recommend doing that, replace the lost running volume by cycling. But that way you won't have any negative impacts in terms of your fitness or your performance readiness, but it could potentially save you from an injury a bit further down the line, and that would have a massive beneficial impact on how you will perform in races now and later, because you managed to stay consistent, take 2 or 3 days off rather than take 2 or 3 months off later down the road. So stay injury free. Avoid big ups and downs in the run training load, progress things really slowly, and nip things in the bud when you feel a niggle coming on. Those would be the main things there to summarize this point. And tip number 2 for running is to do extensive rather than intensive training, or to extend rather than intensify when you're progressing your key workouts. Running in triathlon is quite different from running fresh, as anybody who has done a triathlon is well aware. Just as a thought experiment, think about how do you think Eliud Kipchoge would run? What would he look like, and what would he do in terms of a time for a marathon after swimming 3,800 meters and cycling 180 kilometers? I think we can say for sure that it would be a very different look and time from his typical marathon performances. And as triathletes, this is the reality that we need to prepare for. That goes for all distances from sprint distance to Ironman. Because if you're going for shorter, if you're doing a sprint distance, you're also going at a much higher intensity. So you'll still be very tired, even if you did the swim of a sprint distance in 10 minutes and the bike in 30 minutes. So you have only 40 minutes of work in you. That's 40 very intense minutes, and that will make a huge difference on your running. So what we need to be in triathlon is we need to be very resistant to fatigue. It's not as much about our maximum capacities as it is about losing a relatively small percentage of our maximum capacity compared to the competition when we run tired off the bike and after also having done the swim. I do think that the longer the race, the greater the effect. So you will see a greater discrepancy between athletes a greater impact of good fatigue resistance versus bad fatigue resistance in an Ironman compared to a sprint triathlon. In a sprint triathlon, maximum capacity would be, relatively speaking, more important than in an Ironman, but it is still important in all of the distances. Anyway, with this in mind, I think one of the key things to think about in your run training and progression of your key run sessions is that it's more beneficial to extend rather than to intensify. And this is, again, a point that I think to some extent is true in swim and bike training. But I think it is, relatively speaking, the most important when it comes to run training, because the run is the last of the disciplines we do in the race. So we do it with the most fatigue, and it requires the strongest fatigue resistance. So by extending rather than intensifying, what I mean is that it's more important for you to try to increase the total amount of running you do at a certain intensity within a given workout, or even within a given interval, compared to increasing the intensity itself. So to give an example, I'll actually refer back to just a couple of episodes ago, the interview that I did with Glenn Poleunis in episode 335. We talked about the training Martin Van Riel did leading into his Ironman 7.3 world record in Dubai. And Glenn said that Martin did a good amount of threshold work and extended tempo/race pace work. And for the threshold work, Glenn specifically said that they didn't try to push the pace of the threshold but rather they try to increase the amount of work done and the duration of the intervals. And one of the key sessions they did, and as far as I understood it, a culmination almost of that progressive extension of work at threshold, was a workout with 3 times 2 miles plus 5 times 1 mile at threshold. So that's 11 miles total, or 17.6 kilometers total work at threshold in one workout. And I just think that that's really good and smart training. That's obviously a very big workout and a hard workout, even when you're controlling the threshold pace. But I think it goes to show, it shows the example very well. And I think the contrary to that, the tendency for a lot of athletes would be to, rather than to extend the workout gradually and extend the amount of threshold work, it would be to have a fixed workout. Let's say 5 times 1 mile at threshold would be quite a common workout to do. And then to try to push that threshold pace week by week. And actually, after a few weeks, it's probably no longer your threshold pace, but it's still a pace that you can do and you feel good because you can progress your performance in the workout. But it's not ideal for developing the type of running strength and the type of running durability that you need to perform well in a triathlon. So yeah, the example of doing 5 times 1 miles and trying to go a little faster each week is to intensify. But what I think you should do is to do what Martin Van Riel did and extend over time instead. So another aspect of this, rather than just thinking about it in terms of workout progression, is our preference of workouts. So we often like to do traditional runners workouts like 400s on the track, lung busting 400s, or 800s where we're really on the limit. Most of us are less likely to do a 40-minute tempo run, because when runners do tempo runs, they're often 20-minute close to all out runs, so which is not really a tempo run. So that's something that is much less common to see. I do think that a lot of the best athletes are doing those types of workouts, or long intervals, like 10-minute intervals, and we're doing 6 times 10 minutes with short rests. I would argue that we often devalue these types of longer, slightly sub-maximal, but very solid workouts in favor of those really hard and fast workouts. And those workouts are great for building your maximal running capacity, which of course also plays into your running performance on race day, but they are not as good for our ability to actually hold a reasonable pace when fatigued. So I think that those types of workouts, the longer tempo runs, threshold workouts where you extend rather than intensify, those are the types of workouts that should be more of the staple of your training program. And there is a time and place to do the faster work for sure, but it's not the staple of a training program for a triathlete, in my opinion. And this is even more true the longer the distance that you're training for. All right, so those were all of the tips that I had for you today. I hope that you enjoyed that. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where I'll have links to the TTS Thursday episode about swim video analysis, and also to episode 335, the interview with Glenn Poleunis, which I talked about here in the last tip related to running. Next Monday, we will have another episode, and I've honestly fallen behind a bit on researching potential guests. So I don't have anybody lined up. I have a few interviews lined up for a couple of weeks from now, but it won't be one of those interviews that I already have scheduled that will be out next Monday. So we'll see if I have an interview or whether I'll do another solo episode. Of course, if you have suggestions for guests, keep in mind that I prefer to interview coaches, practitioners like physiotherapists or bike fitters or people of that nature, or researchers, not so much athletes so coaches, practitioners, or researchers would be the main target audience for interviewees if you do send me suggestions. But I'm happy to receive suggestions. Please do email me and I'll consider them all. Now, if you want to improve your triathlon performance with some expert help, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or a training plan if you're not ready to move into coaching. Whether you're just getting into triathlon or you're trying to qualify for a world championship event or even want to race professionally, we do have experience in all of those scenarios and we'd love to discuss with you and see if we can help you on your triathlon journey. Find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com, and would love to have a chat. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and your swim training consistency, and get 20% off your order of the trainer with the promo code that you can get on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. And don't forget that it's a risk-free investment. If you don't love it after 2 weeks, send it back and you'll get a full refund. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.